Good evening. Welcome to DEAR. My name's Lynn Cook, and I'm the organizer of this program. And I'd like to begin by thanking very much Kristen Poor and Patrick Heilman, who work very hard to make it happen. I'd also like to thank Art for Art's Sake, our patrons, who, without whose support, it also would not happen. This is the last in this season's series. Unfortunately, the talk that Inigo Manglano-Valle was going to give has had to be cancelled. So I hope you'll join us again in the fall when we recommence in September. It is an enormous pleasure to welcome Amy Sillman, who's giving tonight's talk on John Chamberlain's work. I can see from the audience that she is well known to you. She lives and works in the city, as you know, and had received her BFA from the School of Visual Arts in 1979, and then more recently from Bard College, her MFA in 1995. She's shown here since 1991, with shows in 1996-98 at Case Kaplan and more recently at Brett's Kema. Currently, there's an exhibition in the Directions series at the Hirshhorn Museum, which goes through July and then moves to the Tang in Skidmore College. And next year, she will be at the American Academy in Rome. Please, Berlin, I'm sorry, American Academy in Berlin. Please join me in welcoming Amy.
Thanks. Actually, the really nice man who stands at the back asked me to make sure that you could hear me in the back. Can you hear me in the back? All good? Okay, cool. I want to thank Lynn Cook for giving me the opportunity to get my BFA, or my BA. I'm basically going to deliver a very extensive term paper. I want to really thank Kristen Poor and Yvonne Bialek and Patrick Heilman for their incredible work and support in helping me arrange this stuff. This is my desktop. This is very personal. Let's get out of here. I've never given a electronic slide talk. I've only done. I mean, they're not even slides anymore. Listen, I'm really nervous, so let's get going. Good crowd. Make sure there's not that music. Got that right. 600 seconds, that ought to be good. I've got like 4,000 images. This is John Chamberlain with the Supremes. God, you guys are a great crowd. What did the bra say to the hat? I'll hang with these two, you go on ahead. In 1971, John Chamberlain had a retrospective at the Guggenheim Museum. I found 2 reviews of his show in the New York Times by Hilton Kramer. One concluded with this, quote, "The show that Mrs. Waldman has organized is of interest now primarily to researchers gathering data on the wayward tastes of another era," unquote. Well, a bad review from Hilton Kramer probably means something good about your artwork, but the idea of wayward taste from another era was of great interest to me. I love wayward tastes from another era, and I definitely noticed that most people seemed not to know much at all about the arc of Chamberlain's work. So I started to think, what does John Chamberlain's work offer us today, and why would we be interested in it? And I've come to think that it is precisely the issue of taste and all that refracts outward from taste that makes his work provocative and interesting. Chamberlain's work sticks out like a sore thumb, especially at Dia Beacon, where this isn't. First of all, it involves expressionism, which is not the expected Dia taste. So it's reasonable to ask, what's he doing in this collection anyway? And then there's the huge difference between areas of his work, between, for example, his most familiar work in crushed metal and his foam couches, which function kind of like today's and tomorrow's parties. As Klaus Curtis has written, furniture as sculpture as instant party. I saw a Chamberlain couch in Marfa in 2002, and it was an eye-opener, to say the least. These are huge pieces of furniture accompanied by video monitors. When I was there, what was being broadcast was the film that you just saw, a kind of Jack Smith hippie movie, and there was a printed statement nearby that explained how his work was about laziness. That's when I started to really wonder about John Chamberlain. His work seems to have to do with vulgarity. What do I mean by vulgarity? Well, many things. Bodily vulgar, sexual, common, low. Socially vulgar, against our taste, brazen, uncouth, obsequious. And historically or philosophically vulgar, repeating things that should be ended, making a mockery of progress, and insisting on the lyrical, the expressionist, the mannerist, the sentimental, and all that is over the top. As for the first category, sexually vulgar, Chamberlain constantly invokes the sexual and intuitive to describe his way of working and thinking. He has said many times, "I deal with material as I see fit in terms of my decision-making," which has to do primarily with sexual and intuitive thinking. Gary Indiana wrote about his couches, quote, "Consider the eroticism of the massive foam couches, vast, brooding, carnal invitations designed for one thing and one thing only." 2, regarding taste. Against our notions of decorum, taste, good taste, and therefore pushing up against class distinction. The 2 most important things in Chamberlain's work for me are the sex and the humor. Chamberlain's work is not only brazen and carnal, it is brazenly comical about its baseness and an enjoyment of the low. Chamberlain's humor spans a huge area of humor that I could do a whole second lecture about, including wit, parody, displacement, misuse, and downright slapstick. Sometimes his work seems to make a mockery of all the formal language that it speaks, and certainly his titles read like a parade of burlesque acts or characters. Mrs. Suede Schwooze, Lord Suckfist, Infected Eucharist, One-Stop Smut Shop, Pardon My Breeze, Wandering Bliss meets Fruit of the Loom. Chamberlain talks about his, hold on I gotta get some water. Chamberlain talks about his formal techniques in a completely comical and mundane way that deflates high seriousness. For instance, he speaks often of his technique of wadding. And then, when asked what wadding is, he says that it's like how people use toilet paper or throw towels on the towel rack in the bathroom. In 1983, he stated, "The wadding, most people can't do it. The only time they can is instinctive with toilet paper. They get this long line of material and they do something with it, very personal." Dan Graham writes that the couches contain 3 forms of irony: cultural, aesthetic, and social. More about that later. Yet Chamberlain's more slapstick description of the work is to say simply that these foam pieces originated while he was trying to figure out how to change a mattress pad with a friend, and the mattress pad foam kept getting out of whack. Shoving the foam rubber into the mattress was funny, he said. 3, vulgarity as a construct. In 1994, T.J. Clark wrote an article called "In Defense of Abstract Expressionism," which appeared in October magazine. In it, he says, quote, "I think we might come to describe abstract expressionist paintings better if we took them above all to be vulgar. To call an artwork vulgar is to do something more transgressive than to call it low or inform. The term vulgar points 2 ways: to the object itself, some atrociously visual quality that the object will never stop betraying, however hard it tries, and to the object's existence in a particular social world." And later in the article, writing about Hans Hofmann, he says, "Seen in its normal surroundings, past the unobtrusive sofas and the calla lilies, that unique taste of the picture-buying classes in America, Hofmann seems always to be blurting out a dirty secret that the rest of the decor is conspiring to keep." In a way, T.J. Clark's complicated look at abstract expressionism in and out of its time and Hilton Kramer's dismissal of Chamberlain's show are not dissimilar in one way. They equally declare the era of abstract expressionism to be over. But Clark, importantly, brings us to the kind of vulgarly comic via the idea of the ludicrous in his examination of the relationship between ABEX and our time. At the end of the article, Clark says, "It seems I cannot quite abandon the equation of art with lyric. And then, the lyric in our time is deeply ludicrous. The deep ludicrousness of lyric is Abax's subject, to which it returns like a tooth to a loosening tongue. Maybe it's because I'm a painter rather than an art historian, but the image of Abax as a sickening tooth coming loose in the mouth delights me. So Clarke's equation of Abax's condition with the ludicrous, which is connected to the humorous via the absurd, is crucial to me. It involves a return of the repressed in Abax that interests me and which defies modernist time's one-way arrow. My own personal interest as a painter is to look at expressions of ugly or ridiculous feelings, i.e. wayward tastes, with intense enjoyment. What makes you cringe is precisely connected to what is repressed. And while capitalism and lyricism are particularly vulgar aisles in the capitalist supermarket, and I really don't care if they go chapter 11, the expressive is a territory that I believe in. As Sidney Tillman, writing in 1989 about Koons and Olitsky, wrote, quote, "Much of modernism's taste is rooted in a form of bad taste. A too generalized taste has debilitated most of modern art. Taste, as I define it, is not just about itself, but an index of contact with feeling." I'd like to propose the connection or difference between a vulgarian and a dandy. I believe that the vulgarian is a figure on the flip side of the same coin as the dandy. But let me begin by showing you some instances of what interests me about Chamberlain in relation to some work that I'm interested in today. His work is about personification, the stances or postures or the feeling of specific modern-type figures. Here's a Rodin. Sometimes these figures are drawn into themselves, absorbed. There's a stockholder. Often they are collapsed or wrecked. Here's a Genskin. The work is Baroque. Fractured surfaces are a register of time and change and motion. Bernini, Warhol. It's a performative sense of time and can invoke a showy parody of splendor. Judd called it immoderate, snazzy, and elegant in the wrong way. Andrea Fraser. It foregrounds color and color as material. This is Helio. I don't know how to say it. Oiticica. How do you say it? Oiticica. And Caterina Grossa. And desire, the meeting of flesh and commodity, like Koons or Oldenburg. Often his work is materially abject. Carolee Schneemann. Sometimes the work takes the form of a lump instead of a figure, a wadded up ball. His over-the-top aesthetic might be called feminine, or if nothing else, not clearly masculine or feminine, of uncertain gender, maybe even approaching camp. The work asserts itself as essentially painterly and gestural. Its surface is fractured, complex, built by hand. And the work is between painting and sculpture. Benglis. The use of a patterned surface on a sculpture further reinforces or collapses the difference between painting and sculpture in an absurd and synthetic way. Rachel Harrison. Stella. Surface becomes all. It's rough, modeled, and handmade to an ugly degree. Vest. Oldenburg. It's made of materials, everyday materials, and performs its materiality. Morris. It's about wreckage. Felix Schramm. And it is about collage with rough materials. This is Knobel, and this is too. What I've shown you already fits into what most people know of Chamberlain's work, the crushed and painted steel, but he has suffered from what Brian O'Doherty calls category trouble, being always out of joint. Chamberlain wasn't part of the rhetoric of a specific movement, which hurt his career. He has been aligned at various times with beat poetry, collage, welded junk sculpture, Abax, pop, Warhol-style movies, and process art. But many people don't know much about his work with film, foam, plastic, paper, foil, video, or text. Though Chamberlain's fans include many eminent writers, artists, and curators, I found that another huge group of people know little or nothing about the arc of his endeavors. So while preparing this lecture, I thought a lot about how and why an artist's work can remain hidden or can become a cliché, and how interesting Chamberlain is for having suffered both of these fates. So this lecture will be a kind of giant book report, especially about Chamberlain's work from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and I will fit in as much as possible in an hour, although I'll have to leave a lot out, and I will try to embed this narrative with some ideas. In the early 20th century, Baudelaire wrote of his concept of the French poet ragpicker. He describes this person as an archivist of the city's refuse. Quote, "He sorts things out and selects judiciously. He collects like a miser guarding a treasure, refuse which will assume the shape of useful or gratifying objects between the jaws of the goddess of industry." But the updated artist of the world whom Alan Capro describes in 1958 is actively using these everyday materials. He says, we must become preoccupied with and even dazzled by the spaces and objects of our everyday life. We shall utilize the specific substances of sight, sound, movement, people, odors, and touch. Objects of every sort are materials for the new art. Paint, chairs, food, electric and neon light, smoke, water, old socks, a dog, movies, 1,000 other things that will be discovered by the present generation. They will be sensed in dreams and in horrible accidents, an odor of crushed strawberries, a letter from a friend, or a billboard selling Drano. Here's Chamberlain. The person who works in this vein is a different kind of person from the dandy who walks along the boulevard, and I started to think about the vulgarian as existing precisely on the flip side of the same coin as the dandy. The vulgarian is about presence, not absence. The vulgarian is actively involved with the sexual, the dirty, the obscene, and the vulgarian transgresses refinement and can be embarrassing. Vulgarians come from the body, dandies come from the mind. Of course, the vulgarian is also a construct. Both the dandy and the vulgarian function within a set of meaningful gestures, and each is conscious of the cliché. The vulgarian also knows that his or her gesture involves imitation, mimicry, and parody, but the vulgarian uses the twin poles of desire and repulsion, as the dandy uses attraction and detachment. Dandies don't care, vulgarians care. Though, of course, underneath it all, dandies care utterly and are attuned to society's every move, and vulgarians may or may not care at all. John Chamberlain was born in 1927 in Indiana and moved to Chicago when he was around 3. In 1943, at age 16, he left the Midwest with a buddy, and en route out west, he joined the Navy and spent 4 years on this aircraft carrier, the USS Tulagi, in the Atlantic and the Pacific. And by the way, here's his piece, Doomsday Flotilla, that was installed in the DIA in '82. He returned to Detroit and then moved to Chicago at the age of 23. In the 1950s, Chamberlain was a hairdresser and a makeup man, even teaching at a hairdressing and makeup school at one point. He said, quote, "I could do the job easily. I was sort of ahead of my time. Like if we had a Vogue magazine lying around and somebody saw a hairdo in it, I was the one who could figure out how to do it. When I took my state board, I passed my Marcelling test with the cold iron." Alan Stone, the dealer, recalled him at this time in this way. "John was supporting himself by working in a hairdressing salon. I think he was very embarrassed by his salon days and presented himself as a very gruff and hairy character, looking more like a North Woodsman than a sculptor. He would come to the very sedate law firm where I was working and bring new work to show me. The receptionist would call me saying, 'A person is here to see you.' But they wouldn't let him sit in the client's waiting room, but rather they would put him in the messenger's delivery room. When I asked why they would treat my client this way, they said that he didn't go with the Courier and Ives decor." He worked on bouffants. Michael Kimmelman wrote in the New York Times in 2003, "The connection between Chamberlain's sculptures and bouffant hairdos is an unexplored area of art historical inquiry." This is one of his foam sculptures from 1967. Chamberlain went to the Art Institute briefly, and then he went to the University of Illinois even more briefly. And while at the Art Institute, this de Kooning excavation from 1950 was hanging. It was a piece that he particularly loved. And he also was really interested in the Indian architecture, the Hindu architecture at Khajuraho, and wrote a paper about it. Here's some details of the decorative facade of the temple, which seem connected to his work. In 1955, Chamberlain went to Black Mountain College in Asheville. Here's Albers teaching his class looking at a shape. He had made his strong mark on the ethos of the school, but had left by the time Chamberlain arrived in 55. The head of the school at that time was the poet Charles Olson. In an interview with Lawrence Weiner, Chamberlain has said, "My teachers were Klein, de Kooning, Charles Olson. Klein gave me the structure." Here's the Chamberlain. De Kooning gave me the color. Here's the Chamberlain. But I only agreed with him because the auto color was the same. It had nothing to do with being derivative. De Kooning knew about the color of America. The color of America is reflected in their automobiles. Olson basically gave Chamberlain his theory. Olson's projective verse is a manifesto about, in part, the kinetics of American-type poetry. He talks about proprioception, a term that, as poet Eileen Miles pointed out to me yesterday, is now in use only by dentists, trying to help you figure out where the pain is. He says that the poem discharges energy as it moves from the poet to the reader, via the poet's speaking voice, his or her own embodiment and breath. The poem exists in the open field of the page, where the empty spaces are as important as the words printed upon it, and the poem is like a many-sided object, touching the world, the speaker, the hearer, at many points, and making a kind of spatial polyhedron. And it is about speed. He says in projective verse, if you set up as a poet, use the process at all points. Always one perception must move, instanter, on another. One perception must be followed immediately by another, he says, and the poem, now I'm not quoting, the poem rides along the breath that carries the energy as it moves from brain to body via breath. This is crucial to the art of the time, the mind and body functioning as one, through a material intelligence that involves immediate use of both. It's not about expression, it's about communication, to speak to another citizen. He says in projective verse, quote, "Keep it moving as fast as you can, citizen." The word citizen is important because this is a social engagement, not a solipsistic one. Here is the poet Robert Creeley, who taught poetry at Black Mountain, Chamberlain's closest person there. Dieter Schwartz, director of the Kunstmuseum in Winterthur, said, quote, "Chamberlain's and Creeley's word combinations are an approach to materials that does not derive from an internal artist-language connection, nor from psychology or the unconscious. This working method, initiated by Creeley and taken up by Chamberlain, is predicated on the artist's material connection, so it is wholly external and not internal. It is all about the surface of words, the surface of materials, and not about the reflection of the artist's self. The material determines the moment of activity, the instant when something is perceived and understood, seeing how the imagination might articulate that experience." Unquote. This was a moment when expressionism had not yet been sold into expressionism. And I will talk more about Chamberlain's various language projects, especially in the late 60s, later. Actually, Chamberlain had said that one of his most important things he learned early on was to use a stapler in his usual mundane way, which he learned from Alfred Leslie, who was already using one. He said that stapling allowed for the immediate, quote, "You just throw on the material and staple it down." Rauschenberg, Cage, Buckminster Fuller, Twombly, de Kooning, Albers all spent time at Black Mountain, arguably the most radical and generative art school in the history of America. Here's Rauschenberg and Cage's collaborative piece from that time, 1953 automobile tire print. Twombly was at Black Mountain, and early Chamberlain drawings are clearly in the same vein or influenced. De Kooning taught there, and There he is. And you can see here the way Chamberlain used color analogously. In 1956, Chamberlain moved to New York City and hung out regularly at the Cedar Tavern with the other artists and the poets. Here's Larry Rivers, Jack Kerouac, and then somebody, I actually don't know who it is, maybe some of you do, and then Allen Ginsberg. And he was deeply influenced by the work of David Smith. He was very briefly welding, and they were both included in some junk sculpture shows in the 1950s, but Chamberlain moved away almost immediately from the idiom of junk sculptor. For one thing, from 1957 or so, his work was fitted together by hand through balance and chance operations as more than any kind of traditional joining. Chamberlain said that he hated welding. For all of its apparent solidity, his work had he made his work more by chance operations and balance. He threw things, he kicked stuff, he got drunk and fitted it by hand and took it apart and put it back together, more than any of the traditional sculptural techniques of joining of parts. This is an early piece of his called Wanamedi Gate from the late 1950s. And this is his first, I think his first real Chamberlain piece. It's called Shortstop. It's from 1957. And he made it at Larry Rivers' house by taking fenders off Rivers' 1929 antique Ford and driving over it in his truck. This is important because Chamberlain asserts the difference between junk art or found art here, in that he used an antique car fender and actually wrecked something of value, quite the opposite of found sculpture. Chamberlain said, quote, "I drive over it a few times to rearrange its shape, which was the beginning of what I now know as process," unquote. In 1961, Jean Tinguely arrived in New York to show his self-destructing junk sculpture. He said, "Immobility does not exist. Don't be subject to the influence of out-of-date concepts. Resist the anxious wish to fix the instantaneous, to kill that which is living." I was interested to learn that the surrealist Richard Huelsenbeck, who was living in New York at the time, arranged a meeting between Tinguely and Chamberlain, and also other meetings with Rauschenberg, Johns, and Duchamp. They urged him not to show this piece at MoMA, actually, and to find an abandoned loft or warehouse, but he was determined to show at MoMA, so he convinced, Tinguely was determined to show there, and he convinced René Darnancourt to give him the museum. And that's where this piece was done. By the early 1960s, Chamberlain's work had fully moved away from the scrapyard aesthetic in the sense that it engaged with color and essentially became three-dimensional painting. Here's M. Junior Love from 1962. Here's another colored sculpture. I don't think I have a title from that time where it starts to be fully painterly. And here's Allegia Clark from the same year. I'm sure that a case could be made that Chamberlain's ideas coming out of his Black Mountain education are not entirely out of whack with ideas that concern South American modernists, especially including a desire for constant experimentation, social interaction, and to some extent, I think, the roots that you can trace back to the Russian constructivists. In any case, he said that, he felt that at this time his big influence was de Kooning, his use of color and his assembly of pictures. And I think that something that doesn't really get spoken about as much as his important influence in Oldenburg. Barbara Rose, writing about Oldenburg's store in 1969, says, quote, "The store was a place of quick love, as well as a museum. With its brilliant color, sensuous surfaces, and abundance of goods, the store hinted at the joys and pleasures that industrial civilization might bring. It was also both a satire on the American obsession to consume and a celebration of the vitality of American culture." Here's the classic Chamberlain work from the early mid-60s, where you can see that his use of color and his process of fitting by hand was in high gear. These are not welded together, they're fitted. To speak first about color. Color in sculpture prior to Chamberlain was often a matter of painting something a monochrome. Judd wrote that Chamberlain was the first and really the only sculptor to really use color. One might think of Calder, Caro, or shown here, an all-green Louise Nevelson. And it's interesting to me that of the few people who are involved in color in sculpture, many are women, like Nevelson, Hesse, and Anne Truitt. The subject for an entirely different lecture should be the sexism involved in Judd's dismissal of Truett's work, and especially the sexism of Judd's assertion that it was Chamberlain who basically invented color in sculpture. But perhaps this marks Chamberlain as feminized, even while he's so virile, and gives even a further idea of why he has in some ways been marginalized. In any case, the only other sculptor given credit for color in sculpture at the time is George Sugarman, but his work is painted not like a painterly Abex painting, but as a set of parts, with each part a separate color. Whereas with Chamberlain, you have the full extravagance of painting and painterliness. These are made like paintings, they are paintings. The color does everything that color does in oil paintings: scumbles, drips, passage. But it happens in 3 dimensions and changes as you move around the object, as though there were different paintings on each side. Here, Klaus Curtis describes how sexy the color functions are in Chamberlain's Catalogue Raisonné. Quote, "The inhaling swell is anchored by a diagonal of off-whites that occasionally secretes a pale, shiny blue and drips with a cascade of yellow-orange. Broad, irregular blades of red push out from underneath." Oops, going ahead. Go to that one. Oh, sorry, I forgot one. You'll just have to imagine a pale silver lilac box-like container capped with a peaked golden umbral shape until it bursts open to reveal a flatulent gable sheltering a wrinkled blue cone with an orifice enveloping red folds. The way Chamberlain himself puts it is very different. Speaking of the planar and chromatic three-dimensionality of this piece, Miss Lucy Pink, from 1963, Chamberlain said simply, "Miss Lucy Pink has a sort of front and a back. I look at the piece every now and then, and sometimes it reminds me of somebody who's putting on a good front. But then you take a look around the back and her ass is hanging out." By 1962, Chamberlain had been included in a group show at MoMA and had had a one-man show at Leo Castelli. He was a respected and established artist, and yet, as Curtis writes, quote, "His acceptance was primarily among fellow artists and the immediate inner circle of the art world. Deserved critical and commercial success still eluded him," unquote. 1963, this is not 1963, but this is a better picture than the one from then. 1963 kicks off one of the best and most puzzling times in the arc of Chamberlain's work, because by the middle of the 60s, he had begun branching way out of the crushed cars and working with such material as kitchen sponges, urethane foam, melted plastic, aluminum foil, and film. He moved back and forth between LA and New York at least 11 times, if not more, and he made at least 3 bodies of paintings and who knows how many prints, drawings, and collages. He began to show his work in Europe, and during this restless time, he removed himself from his own cliché production by quitting working with the painted scrap steel for 7 years in 1967, not to return until 1974 with 2 small incursions into sculptures, like steel sculptures, just in their little ones. Yet his staunchest support came from the stalwart quarters of Donald Judd and Barbara Rose. At this time, Klaus Curtis put it, Chamberlain remained a pagan friend of the monastic order. In 1963, he moved his family to New Mexico and then to Topanga Canyon in LA. In this same year that JFK was assassinated, Chamberlain began to make these paintings. Oops. As he says, "I was interested in the glare and the fluff." These paintings are all named after popular singing groups. This one's called the Righteous Brothers, whom we just saw. And at the time, in his studio was hanging 2 pieces of art. One was a print of 100 soup cans by Warhol, and another was a 1959 aluminum painting by Frank Stella. Here's another painting called Dee Dee Sharp. By the way, Dee Dee Sharp was the singer whose song ushered in the popular dance, the mashed potato. Here's the painting. And this is the painting called Ray Charles. Just so you know. These paintings were made of hundreds of thin veils of color layered on top of each other, spray painted onto Formica tiles using an extremely thin down solution, a teaspoon of car lacquer pigment suspended in a full can of clear glaze. The paintings had a strange floaty glaze that made the color look like it was inside the surface. Judd said he liked them because, quote, "they didn't have any spatial business." This was when he made a painting called The Supremes and sold one to Diana Ross. In 1966, Chamberlain is in California again after back and forth between New York and California a couple times. He's back in California and made a set of clean designed works that were planned in advance through drawings using a French curve. This was the only time Chamberlain made drawings first, as plans for works. He was not satisfied with these works and pronounced them not a big success and stopped making them. He never drew again as plan or sketch for sculpture, only making sculptures by hand first and drawings later. However, the failed French curve sculptures led to a huge body of foam work beginning in 1966. These amazing, very raw and swift foam sculptures and couches that were done over the next six years began with a set of 30 or so quickly made sculptures from kitchen sponges, and these became the basis for numerous works with urethane foam, all cinched and tied with lassos and ropes, some bare and some with paint dripped on them. Let me see if I have, nope, oops. I'll show you some more later. They were remarkably vigorous works that would seem to speak a common language with process art, and yet at the time they were largely overlooked and not at all commercially successful, though they've been talked about quite a bit in the past couple years. In the exact same year, Warhol's Silver Clouds were done, by the way. This is his picture of his show from Virginia Dwan Gallery in LA in that fall of that year. He showed the body of work almost immediately after an explosion of making them, and then he showed them in Cologne and Munich in '67. None were sold. All were returned to Chamberlain, and he sold a few for pocket money to anybody who asked, including Walter Hopps, who came knocking at the studio door, and who walked away with one for $20. Chamberlain gave the rest away or put them in storage. His foam work asserts some of the basic goals and attitudes of process art of the early '70s, yet the foams began before Morris even made his felt pieces. In 1969, Chamberlain was included in the exhibition New Media, New Methods at MoMA, which was curated by Kynaston McShine. One foam piece from '67 was in the show called Lop Nar Nor, along with a Robert Morris felt piece dating '68. By the way, I looked it up, and the Chamberlain was listed as being worth $900, and the Morris was worth $5,000. Warhol, Serra, Hesse, and others were included. There was no catalog for the show. Subsequently, Chamberlain was left out of the massive surveys of the new art from '69 at the Whitney and in Europe. And Robert Morris, who wrote virtually the textbook on the art of the '70s, never wrote a word on Chamberlain, though clearly he knew his work, because they both showed at Castelli together and had been in this MoMA show together. I'll say a bit more about that further on. Chamberlain was totally ahead of his time with his '67 foam couches. These are gargantuan foam slabs up to 25 feet long that have been cut and carved into roughly and crudely with a kitchen knife and by hand. There's a film of Chamberlain making one on YouTube that you can go find if you go there. He's cutting and slashing the foam with giant knives while pretty girls and guys hang around drinking and smoking on them. They're covered with fabric, and they serve as soft and rather ridiculous public resting stations for people to flop onto. In installation form, these are flanked by video monitors that broadcast looped programs that the viewers can gaze at. In some cases, Chamberlain's own quasi-Warhol, quasi-Jack Smith softcore kind of movie. In a later installation in 1981 in Germany, really predating everyone, the monitors played a loop program of American television commercials. And in fact, apparently many of them were fake commercials that you get off Saturday Night Live. Dan Graham has pointed to these couches as important. They're soft surfaces offering a physiologically charged, sensate experience, not unlike sex or drugs, that confuses subject and object in social space. Graham has also written of the many layers of irony involved, as he says in Rock My Religion, a cultural and aesthetic irony in Chamberlain's questioning of the effect of mass consumption, and a social irony concerning the economics of built-in obsolescence, unquote. Chamberlain noted often that the rate at which the urethane foam deteriorates is faster than that of human cell tissue, which makes people uncomfortable. In 1967, Chamberlain was back in New York. Here's what Chamberlain said about this period. I was tired of using automobile materials because the only responses I ever got was that the only response I ever got was that I was making automobile crashes and that I used the automobile as some symbolic bullshit about our society. All of a sudden, sculpture was the only thing that was supposed not to have color in our society. The fact that all this material had color had made it very interesting for me, but the more interested I got, the more everyone kept insisting it was car crashes. Since nobody got it, I grew bored with the whole idea and thought I would do something with no color. Unquote. He officially quit making the crushed metal sculptures for 7 years and worked instead for a while on unpainted galvanized steel boxes that were sometimes fabricated and other times found. It is said that he worked on some throwaway Judd boxes that had been trashed for having slight irregularities. I'm not entirely sure if that's true. It's unclear. But other boxes were fabricated specially for him to crush. He based the proportions of these boxes on the proportions of cigarette packs at the time, because he was going to nightclubs like Max's every night and was famous for sitting around drinking and crushing cigarette packs. Someone in a 1983 interview said, "John, no one can crush a pack of Gauloises like you can." A night when you got lucky at Max's Kansas City could involve getting one of these throwaway Chamberlains. Chamberlain spent much of 1968, the next year, involved in film. He made Wedding Night, The Secret Life of Hernando Cortez, and then Wide Point. These are 16mm films, very Jack Smith, Andy Warhol in style. They all star Taylor Mead and Ultraviolet, and they're almost like parodies of various forms of experimental film at the time. They're kind of ambient, abstract, Dionysian visual extravaganzas, where the characters exist in exotic, dreamy places with meandering scripts and voluptuous goings-on. Chamberlain himself hung around the set of Warhol's Lonesome Cowboys and took notes and took photographs too. He was asked to be in Lonesome Cowboys when Undine failed to show up, but he said no. He had lots of other ideas for other film projects that were never completed, including a vehicle for Superstar Viva about a Navajo creation myth, and another film that was supposed to be based on the secret life of William Shakespeare. Wide Point is his third film, which is a kind of installation project, also not realized, that was shot on 7 projectors and was supposed to be projected on 7 screens simultaneously. In 1969, after the year of film, he moved into a year of language and text projects via his involvement with the art and technology program run by Maurice Tuchman at LACMA, who tried to put together artists and corporations to see if productive things would happen when they were paired together as collaborators. Chamberlain was paired first with Dart Industries and then rather inexplicably with the Rand Corporation. At DART, he tried to realize a video project that had been suggested to him by Douglas Hubler, a mapping project to be simultaneously screened on 14 screens. It didn't pan out. Then he came up with a small environmental project called Snifter that involved presenting hundreds of odors indexed into a kind of parody of poetics. Mother's Milk, German Shepherd, Wrestling Arena, Moonshot at Cape Kennedy, Hostess Cupcakes, Larry Bell's Studio, Charlie McCarthy. This project didn't pan out either, so Chamberlain moved on to the Rand Corporation. As you may know, Rand is a conservative think tank that functions like the brain of the military-industrial complex. It specializes in the development and study of gaming structures, including war games. Rand was partially responsible for the development of the internet and certainly responsible for war policy making. It's where Daniel Ellsberg worked and from where he stole the Pentagon Papers that he released to the press about Vietnam policy. Chamberlain did no political activist work there at all. Instead, he worked for 6 rather disastrous weeks at the height of the Vietnam War on poetic and absurd texts. And he complained to a friend, "The people are uptight. I can't get into any of their circuits. You know, like the girls wear too much underwear." He tried arranging screenings of the Hernando Cortez film, which most of them hated, and the film was shut down. He ended up sending questionnaires that asked all of the Rand employees to send him answers, not questions, to his office in 1138. They mostly refused and sent him insulting notes like, "The answer is to terminate Chamberlain," and "fuck you." He ended up writing his own answers and published them in a 34-page long, sort of absurdist found poetry text formulation, which is divided into 2 parts. What are the circumstances to these responses, and what is the response to these circumstances? I actually have a copy of it here, and I can show it to you later. Later in the 70s, Chamberlain worked on other never-realized text projects, including one about collecting hundreds of cliches that could operate in a cliché world of experience and setting them into grids and trying to wash them with different informational fields. Chamberlain is clearly interested in the use of language as a structure and system and material, not unlike his use of tactile materials. Not only did he sustain a long friendship with Robert Creeley, but also with Lawrence Weiner, who interviewed him for his Dia catalog in 1992. His language projects are the part of his work that remains the most obscure, and yet are absolutely in line with the work of contemporary artists. In '69, Chamberlain made one of his only sets of sculpture in the 7-year period that he took away from steel. This is one of those pieces. All of these were made from white scrap appliance material, and what's of interest to me specifically is the fact that he did not try to disguise the sources, and he left on all the drawer handles and appliance finishings visible in the work. Also in 1969, a productive year, he was back in New York City again and made a series of works called the Penthouse Pieces, made of paper bags with paint and resin thrown on them. He has said that he was trying to get the work to express the energy of the blowing up and popping of a paper bag, again, directly related to the idea of Charles Olson and projective verse. These pieces are small and are painted crudely with dripped and thrown resin and metallic paint. In '70, back in East LA again, Chamberlain made a bunch of very LA kind of work made of melted plexiglass, which was at the time a new material. These were sheets of plexi made by heating the material in a giant walk-in oven and forming it into these folded collapsed shapes, which were then annealed with lustrous translucent glazes made of quartz and aluminum in his friend, the artist Larry Bell's vacuum coating machine. Here's a Larry Bell, just so you know. Chamberlain himself has said that he never quite got the bugs out of this process, and he stopped doing it after about a year before he really perfected the use of these new and exotic materials. In 1970, Chamberlain's working again on painting. This is from his series called the Morgan Split paintings. These are made of an elaborate rubbed and sprayed technique of resin and aluminum powder on flat fiberboard panels. And then oil paintings from a series in 1971, which he did, I think, in a hotel room on his way back from Europe or from Asia, which featured a dappled and speckled kind of surface that related to the way he painted the paper pieces. And later, these are some of the oil paintings, which I think look very modern, related to the way he made his fourth set of foam sculptures. Back in New York City again in 1971, his retrospective is held at the Guggenheim, curated by Diane Waldman. The show features a range of many of the materials that he had used to date, including the early welded pieces, the car crash pieces, the foams, the bags, and the plexis. In the lobby of the museum was an enormous installation of one of the couches, which was called a barge. This was the one that Dan Graham wrote about in his book. It was a super subjective, psychedelic, physiological experience that Dan described earlier. It had monitors at either side playing homemade country western music that was being performed by Chamberlain's friends in a loft. I would think that this show would have seemed rather radical and related to the works of the day. And the people I talked to who saw this show said that it was beautiful and that they respected his work tremendously. But Chamberlain seems to have continued to be pigeonholed as an ab-exer, and I'm sure that his social manner and his age marked him as being in a totally different camp from a younger generation of structuralists. Too tactile might be a polite way to put it. If you examine the artist list from the New Media, New Methods show at MoMA, the Anti-Illusion show at the Whitney, and the When Attitudes Become Form show of Harold Zeman in 1969 in Bern, you will find that there are 5 artists who were included in all 3 shows. These were Carl Andre, Bill Bollinger, Robert Morris, Bruce Nauman, and Keith Saunier. Here's a Saunier from '69. Here's Robert Morris from around the same time. Eva Hess was the only woman who was in 2 out of 3. She was in the Whitney show and the When Attitudes Become Form show. And speaking of women and political action, feminists protested outside of MoMA at the next big international show of the time, Information, which was at MoMA in '70, also curated by Kynaston McShine. They protested because it included so few women. The feminists complained that the only women who were included, like Yvonne Rainer and Lucy Lepard, were there because of their male connections. In fact, Yvonne told me that she was in the catalog, but not in the show itself. In 1972, Chamberlain starts to make these amazing foil pieces. They are wadded and crumpled into volumetric balls that radiate outward and inward at the same time. He makes these sculptures for over 2 years, till the time in '74 when he goes back to the painted steel made of scrap metal. These are some of my favorite works that he's done and the least discussed. They came after his retrospective, so they probably weren't widely seen. But to me, they kind of pull off and invert everything that he had done in one go. The colors are iridescent and trashy, sending a patinaed gleam or glare over the whole object, but their wadded and crumpled surfaces are compressed into intense inward energy balls of implosion or collapse, instead of the outward stretching gestures of the painterly steel. They look like moon rocks, or like iridescent meteors that landed from another industrial planet as the foams, but maybe in the same general orbit. They also relate well to a host of other work that happened after him, including Linda Benglis, and this is a Jim Welling, and this is a Halsey Rodman, and this is a Walid Beshti. There are two expressions that come up constantly with Chamberlain. One is his famous "it's all in the fit" remark, which he repeats like a mantra. This is his general description of how he goes about his work, its general assembly. Quote, "I deal with material as I see fit, in terms of my decision making, which has to do primarily with sexual and intuitive thinking. Along with the sexual terms he insists upon are his repeated verbs, wadding, squeezing, hugging, bunching, and scrunching. For Chamberlain, wadding is how you literally make things, and how everything is made with the hands, making and feeling and doing. The hands are the main tools for all of this, a totally tactile, sexualized, instinctual form of making and knowing that produces objects that are both body and object. The hands are tools not only for feeling and making, but for knowing. I think for Chamberlain, the hand is the same as the breath is for Charles Olson, and that his term sex is just a shorthand for an embodied, experiential, and sensate way of knowing the world. As Robert Creeley has written in a poem about Chamberlain, there is a handle to the world that is looked for, a way of taking it in hand. In 1977, he begins work with a wide-lux camera, a camera that has a panoramic lens, working with this camera in the same embodied way that he worked with all other material. He moves around the space rather than fixing in one focal point, and uses the camera as an extension of his own body and eye, and the Baroque flow of spatial change that we feel as we move in the world. From the wide-lux in the late 70s, a horizontal format began to take hold. Long horizontal planes in all media, sprayed paintings, collages, photo sculptures, and ideas for film projections in multiple screens. The idea of the panoramic or extended horizontal line became a third elemental shape in Chamberlain's morphology, along with the tall vertical figure and the wadded-up crumpled ball. These are the gondolas. In 1979, Chamberlain started work on these gondola pieces, each of which was named for a writer or musician. This one is Herman Melville, and this one is Jack Kerouac. These are made from truck chassis, the whole length of which becomes the base for the piece, resolutely sitting on the floor and accumulating parts and pieces as they go along. These long lines make an analogy between the line of the horizon, the line of a poem, the line of a thought, and the line of time as it changes laterally along a horizon. He showed these gondolas at the Dia, along with this piece, the Doomsday Flotilla, in, I think, '92, accompanied by a catalog with an interview with Lawrence Weiner in which they argue about whether or not one should be responsible. As I said before, Chamberlain's other shape is a curled-up, wadded ball. These are the Kiss pieces from 1979, crushed-up oil cans in which each facet is painted a different color. These represent a different way of approaching the painting, more like an actual painting, since the paint is all applied to the whole object, then it's crushed, and then more surfaces may be painted. All of the painting and sculpture procedures happen together, neither wholly before or after each other, as with his other work. The colors of the Kiss pieces are the colors that Judd called Chamberlain's hard, sweet pastel enamels. Chamberlain has returned to painted and crushed steel in '74. Oh, these are more Kisses. returns to paint it in crushed steel in '74, and in '79 created a huge outpouring of tall, almost profile-type works that rise up like Rodin's Balzac into silhouetted figural personas. The paint is applied differently. It seems to come before, during, and after the formulation of the metal itself, and it involves pouring or dripping the paint into piles of scrap metal in his studio and moving the pieces around in the process of the painting and fitting. While looking at the Chamberlains for this lecture, it was these 1979 pieces that particularly struck me as having a specific relationship to work that one might see in galleries or museums now. It would seem to me that their particular physical intimacy, I wonder if there's another one, yep. Their rather absurd vulgarity, their collage-like construction, their comic alignment with kitsch, and above all, their desire to literally project body onto object and then confuse the two makes them feel completely at home at this moment in art making. I have to repeat here the line of Sidney Tillum from earlier. Taste, as I define it, is not just about itself, but an index of contact with feeling. And as Chamberlain has said, art ranks up there with gardening and sex. Art has a lot to do with feeling. I'm sorry to be so blunt. Thank you. Yes. Question, Dan.
We're right next to EAI, and I wanted to mention how important topological sculpture by video artists was. Design of radical software, this furniture where you would merge your body with other people's bodies in different parts of your body. Chamberlain was thoroughly involved in this kind of radical software hippie culture at the time. And of course, when you sit in these former couches, you can feel your own body in relation to other people's body, and you can feel the heat. And I think the great thing about the Guggenheim show that I remember was it's a very hard architecture. If you look down, you can see people relaxing in their own bodies and other people's bodies, because the former couch was in the floor in the center, which had enormous kind of humor. So I guess we bring up the hippie issues.
Dan is my thesis advisor. Right, and topological issues are also the relation, I think, to Ligia Clark, right?
Well, forget about Ligia Clark.
Okay. All right. I have a question. Maybe I could ask you, because you're here, which I'm really excited about. What was the response to his show? Because, I mean, obviously Hilton Kramer trashed it, but then he didn't get written about. I wonder if you know why you're the only person from the time who writes about Chamberlain. Except for, I mean, Judd and Barbara Rose do, but I mean, that 70s crew never says a word about him.
Well, those articles, like design as artists design, subject matter, which is the first article about Malin, Sarah, were turned down by Art Forum. So, I mean, I've written these articles, but actually only artists design as art was actually published by Art Forum. I like the idea of the artist as designer. And of course, today we have, I won't mention names, like Eduardo, people like that, who have a fantasy idea of the 60s. But in fact, all the great artists were doing design then. Archwater and Oldenburg. And of course, what relates Oldenburg, Chamberlain, and Jeff Koons is the work, and I think Judd recognized this, is the work has a lot to do with biopsychological sign. In other words, it was all about sexuality and consumer culture.
Yeah, thanks. I think Dan should take the questions.
And I think Oldenburg's work was so influential to Jeff Koons. He brings up the same issues.
Right.
Well, the opening of the Guggenheim show was very exciting, and everyone knew it was a great show. And it wasn't as if it didn't get attention because he got the cover of Art News and got the cover of Art Forum at that time. But what you're missing is that Chamberlain didn't stand on his own, but was always coupled with Mark DeSubero. So that it wasn't just an absence of articles on Chamberlain, but also an absence on DeSubero, who at that point had fled America and gone to live on a boat in France. And so it was the two of them. It wasn't just Chamberlain on his own.
Thanks.
Last thing, what I love about Chamberlain is everything was one-off. He had an idea, and then he moved on to something else very quickly. But of course, to make money, you have to repeat his work. To make some money, I know he had a boat and a nice lifestyle in Florida.
Right.
But he was pursuing his what I also like is his work. Instead of being a professional artist, the work was kind of amateur experimentational idea of art, and he would discard things if they didn't work immediately.
Right.
And when they worked really well, they worked so well, he didn't want to repeat himself.
That's why we love him. There might not be any questions, which is cool.
His best friend was Dan Flavin.
Right.
They were both like me in Aries.
He was.
And they both came from Flavin was one day from being in Greece. His father was a bus driver, and I think that's where this kind of slapstick humor comes from. Jackie Listen, TV shows like Jackie Listen.
Right.
And what Flavin tried to do was combine television, low culture with high culture. And I think Chamberlain also is interested in poetry and high culture. It was putting the two together.
Right. Do you want to come up? Seriously? You sure?
I thought that was pretty amazing because I didn't know all the details of his work. But there was actually a wonderful video. There was a show at Cooper Hewitt about artists doing design, and there was a film videotape of him actually making a piece.
Yeah, I found a couple of films. I found a film that Pace made. He went to Pace in, I think, '82, and I found a film that Arnie Glimcher made with him, and it's kind of interesting, actually, just to see him talking, and it has all this stuff about his studio. And then I found, he's interviewed in this movie about, what's his name? The pop, Geldzahler. There's that Geldzahler tape called Who Gets to Call It Art? And he's interviewed in that a couple of times, but just a little bit. But I think the best way to see Chamberlain is to go to YouTube and put in Foam Couch Chamberlain, and you'll get this amazing long, hour-long movie of him like hanging out. He's wearing suspenders with no shirt and these really loose, weird white shorts, and he's cutting the foam by hand and serving drinks. Well, yeah. He just turned 81. By the way, here's another fun fact. One of his sons was in Red Crayola. Yeah. He was the drummer. A question? Oh. I'm sorry, wait. I will answer that in 1 second.
Did you choose John Chamberlain to talk about?
Yeah. No, I chose him. Yeah, I love him.
Do you feel a connection between your own work personally and his work? Can you say anything?
Well, in a little bit, like I wrote a little teeny bit about I felt like what I was in there for. I think that it's been an obsession of mine for a while to think about what to do about the idea of expression. I am really obsessed with the idea of like how we can, how to grapple with the idea of expression at this moment because of the problem that was articulated in part by T.J. Clark. And I don't know that I've worked it out, but I feel like, you know, for some of the reasons that Dan was saying, I mean, Chamberlain, I think, presents this incredible, well, the first thing is that, like, when Lynn asked me if I wanted to give a talk, I said, well, I have to talk about somebody who works with color, and I guess it would either be Blinky Palermo or John Chamberlain, and I just felt like Chamberlain was I'm American, he's American. There was a whole trajectory of Blinky Palermo's work and thought that I felt like I would really have to do a lot more research about to kind of really get on some level. I can kind of get Chamberlain. Like, I was actually born in Chicago, in Detroit, and I moved to Chicago, and like, I think that my work is kind of embarrassing. And, you know, seriously, like, I think that there's like a kind of embarrassment quotient that is part of what I'm interested in. So there's this way in which a lot of the people I talked to who I said I'm talking about Chamberlain, went like, huh? Or why? And I realized there's this resistance, and I think it's partly about what you see. If you see a couch, you immediately think that John Chamberlain is like proto-relational aesthetics. But if you see some of the other things, you could think that it was like it should be in a show with these Agenskin, or, you know, and you see another piece and you just think, oh God, this is really awful. So, you know, there's a way in which the awful and the great could be one.
Said something about him being, on one hand, underknown, on the other hand, the concrete problem of very like cliche. And is that to do with recognizability of the
The cliche with recognizability. I mean, I think the reason why it seems cliche now is different from what Hilton Kramer was talking about. For Hilton Kramer, already in 1971, it was a gone, dead, finished thing. And he already had it packaged away into, you know, like lesser than de Kooning and not good anymore. And then just Chamberlain he keeps on going. And I think he probably wouldn't be a cliche if his work were seen again now, if there were, I mean, you know, it's always weird to call for like yet another retrospective of like a famous old guy. I mean, you know, you sort of think like, well, let's have new retrospectives of other people. But there is this way in which I think if one were to see his work now, one would see it in a very different way. And actually, I know that there was a show planned at one point at the Whitney that was supposed to be Chamberlain and Joan Mitchell, and the late Joan Mitchell, and it didn't happen because of just, you know, how museums work, and it just didn't happen, and the Mitchell show went forward without the Chamberlains in it. And I was told that they were worried about what Chamberlain would say about sharing the spotlight with her, and apparently it turned out he was all for it, but the show didn't come off. And I think there have been shows that changed people's attitudes towards stuff. In my lifetime, the Pollock show changed a lot of attitudes about what Pollock was doing and refreshed and changed the way to approach it tremendously. And I think if there were, maybe the Joan Mitchell show didn't quite do that, but, you know, it was important to me and some other people. And I think if there was another show with all this stuff and with this thing that Dan is talking about, and with my sort of, I mean, if I curated the show, it would be partly, there'd be a whole chapter about humor. And I think that's really important. Maybe he's partly cliche because he seems like he doesn't know that it's something that can be parodied, but he totally knows. I'm certain of it. I think his sense of misuse is really important in signaling that the work is self-conscious and self-reflexive.
I want to do an advertisement. I did a show over a year ago at Marfa called Deep Comedy.
Deep Comedy by Dan Graham.
It's coming this summer briefly to American.
Yeah, go see it.
Yes. And of course, I think, I always hated conceptual art, but the work I like had a lot to do with anarchistic humor. And I think, of course, as an American, I'm an anarchist. And I think, also I think we talk about embarrassment. Television itself is aesthetic, is all about embarrassment.
Right.
Like the honeymoon game, when people who just got married found out they had different interests.
on screen.
Embarrassment is pretty much an aesthetic in itself.
Yes, I agree with that. But I guess the thing that I would say that's maybe the only thing I would add to that is that embarrassment is being used consciously by John Chamberlain. It's not like he's not aware of it. I mean, I suppose that on some level you can also sort of think about the way that at some point maybe he started to make work differently when he joined Pace, or maybe he started to work differently when he got much older and started living on a sailboat, or at some point maybe somebody does kind of fall into mannerism, but all of the things that I looked at made me feel that all of it was intentional. Thank you very much.